The scent of ancient parchment and dust was as familiar to Agnes Nettle as the beat of her own heart. She meticulously reshelved a collection of antique herbals in the hushed quiet of the Ethelgard Grand Library, her spectacles perched on the end of her nose. Outside, the city bustled, but within these hallowed walls, only the rustle of turning pages dared to disturb the peace. Agnes, with her sensible bun and an air of perpetual mild disapproval, thrived in this environment of ordered knowledge. Suddenly, the library itself shuddered. Not a gentle tremor, but a deep, guttural vibration that rattled every shelf and sent a cascade of scrolls tumbling to the floor. Agnes, rather than screaming or cowering, merely sighed. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she muttered, adjusting her glasses. "Not another seismic anomaly. Doesn't anyone in this city understand structural integrity?" A roar, a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of the air, followed the tremor. It was not the roar of an earthquake, but of something far more ancient and far less impressed by library rules. A gust of superheated wind, smelling faintly of sulfur and burnt toast, blasted through the main entrance, sending books scattering like frightened pigeons. Then a shadow, colossal and scaled, fell over the grand hall. Agnes looked up, not in fear, but with an expression of profound irritation. Framed in the gaping hole that was once the library entrance stood a creature of myth. A dragon. Not just any dragon, but a truly magnificent specimen. Its scales shimmered like polished obsidian. Its wings, vast and leathery, stirred air with hurricane force. And its eyes, the color of molten gold, fixed on her with an intensity that would have paralyzed a lesser mortal. This was Smogustus, the ancient and legendary dragon of the Ember Peak Mountains, renowned for a hoard beyond imagination and a temper to match. Smogustus surveyed the chaotic scene with a deep, rumbling sigh that dislodged a chunk of the ceiling. "Human? Female?" his voice boomed, a bass rumble that vibrated through Agnes's very bones. "You are adequate. According to ancient draconic tradition, I require a suitable mate. You will accompany me to my lair." Agnes slowly, deliberately, placed the last herbal back on its shelf. "Adequate?" she echoed, her voice surprisingly steady, though a faint tremor ran through her hands. "First of all, I am Agnes. Secondly, suitable mate is hardly an appropriate term for an abduction. Thirdly, are you quite finished destroying a historically significant building? The late medieval manuscripts section alone is irreplaceable, you oversized lizard." She tapped her foot impatiently. "And your posture is terrible. You'll have back problems in your old age." Smogustus blinked. His molten gold eyes, which had intimidated kings and scattered armies, narrowed in confusion. He had expected terror, pleas, perhaps even a futile attempt at resistance. Not a lecture on etiquette and ergonomics. "Posture?" he rumbled, shifting his immense weight, which only caused more plaster to rain down. "I am a dragon. My posture is naturally superior." "It's hunched," Agnes stated, crossing her arms. "And your wings are scuffing the frieze. Honestly, the sheer lack of consideration..." She gestured vaguely at the debris. "This is simply not how one conducts a proper abduction. Where are the negotiations? The demands for tribute? The dramatic monologue? You just burst in like a common hooligan." A plume of smoke, a rather indignant puff, escaped Smogustus's nostrils. "I am Smogustus. My demands are my presence. My monologue is my roar." He let out another, slightly less confident roar. It sounded a little less terrifying and a little more like a frustrated sigh. "Impressive," Agnes said dryly, dusting some plaster from her cardigan. "If you're trying to intimidate a particularly stubborn dust bunny, perhaps. Look, if you insist on dragging me off to your presumably unhygienic lair, can we at least do it with a modicum of efficiency? This whole performance is simply delaying my lunch." Smogustus stared at her for a long moment. His vast mind, which could calculate the exact market value of a goblin's gold tooth, struggling to process this tiny, unflappable human. He had chosen her because the prophecies spoke of a woman of quiet strength, whose heart holds the key to the dragon's sorrow. He hadn't expected a woman of quiet strength who would nitpick his kidnapping technique. "Very well, human. Cease your incessant chatter. You will ride upon my back." "Certainly not," Agnes said, aghast. "You'll wrinkle my cardigan. And I'm quite certain dragon scales are not designed for passenger comfort. Do you even have a safety harness?" "No, I thought not. Unacceptable. I shall walk. Or rather, I shall be carried in a dignified manner." She eyed his enormous claw. "Carefully, mind you. No jostling." Smogustus let out a long, slow sigh that could extinguish a small campfire. He had faced armies with less trepidation than he now faced this librarian. This was going to be a long day. The flight to Ember Peak Mountain was, as Agnes had predicted, an uncomfortable affair. Smugustus, clearly unused to carrying human cargo, adjusted his flight path with clumsy jerks, occasionally dipping alarmingly close to the treetops. Agnes clutched carefully in one massive claw, offered a running commentary on his aerodynamic inefficiencies. "You're not keeping a consistent altitude, you know. And your turns are far too wide. Are you aware of the concept of a leading-edge vortex?" Smugustus growled, a low, frustrated rumble. "Silence, human. I am a creature of raw power, not some feathered bird to be analyzed." "Precision is power," Agnes retorted, squinting against the wind. "Just because you can brute force your way through the air doesn't mean you should. Think of the energy expenditure." Upon arrival at the dragon's lair, a vast, echoing cave system carved deep within the mountain, Agnes was finally released. She landed lightly, smoothing her cardigan as she surveyed her new surroundings. And what surroundings they were, the Hoard. It was legendary, whispered about in taverns and sung about in epic poems. Mountains of gold coins, shimmering emeralds the size of apples, rubies like drops of frozen blood, and ancient artifacts whose value defied counting. It glowed with an internal light, a kaleidoscope of unimaginable wealth. To any other human, it would have been a sight to induce greed, awe, or madness. Agnes, however, merely frowned. "Oh dear," she murmured, pushing her spectacles higher up her nose. "This simply will not do." Smugustus, basking in the golden glow of his treasures, puffed out his chest. "Behold, human, the greatest collection of wealth in all the realms. A testament to my power, my cunning, my magnificence." He looked at her expectantly, waiting for the gushing praise, the fearful awe. Agnes walked forward, her sensible shoes crunching on a carpet of scattered pearls. She knelt, picked up a gleaming gold coin, and examined it critically. "This coin, for instance," she said, holding it up. "Is it from the first dynasty of Eldoria? Or merely a common forgery from the western reaches? They're simply mixed together, you see. No cataloging whatsoever," Smugustus spluttered, a wisp of smoke escaping his nostrils. "Cataloging? It is my hoard. It is beautiful chaos. Each piece tells a tale of conquest." "It tells a tale of disorganization," Agnes countered, moving to a pile of what appeared to be ancient weaponry. "These swords, are they grouped by metallurgy? By historical period? By original owner? This one looks suspiciously like a dwarven craft, yet it's piled with what appears to be elven kindling. Utterly haphazard." She pointed a finger at a towering mound of assorted jewels. "And the jewels! Sapphires with garnets? Amethysts next to common quartz? Do you have any idea how much value you're losing by not grading and separating them?" Smugustus felt a tremor of existential dread. His hoard, the very core of his draconic identity, was being critiqued by a tiny human. "I am a dragon, I hoard." "I do not organize!" "The sheer impracticality." "Nonsense," Agnes said briskly. "Practicality is paramount. A well-organized hoard is an efficient hoard. Imagine, for instance, if you needed a specific magical artifact quickly. Would you prefer to sift through centuries of accumulated junk or consult a properly indexed inventory?" She sniffed. "And the dust. Honestly, it's a health hazard. Do you ever sweep in here?" Smugustus's massive head slumped. He had kidnapped a mate. He had expected a trophy, a companion, someone to appreciate his splendor. He had not expected a librarian intent on imposing order on his magnificent chaos. His ancient, scaly heart, which had swelled with pride moments ago, now felt a distinct prickle of irritation. This was going to be far more challenging than fighting 100 knights. Life in Smugustus's lair quickly established a new, unexpected rhythm. Agnes, true to her nature, could not simply exist amidst the chaos. The unorganized hoard was an affront to her very being. "First things first," she declared on the second day, marching directly up to Smugustus, who was attempting to nap on a particularly uncomfortable pile of ancient rusted battle axes. "We need a schedule." Smugustus opened one golden eye. "A schedule? For what, human?" "The sun rises, the sun sets. I nap, I eat, I occasionally incinerate an errant goat. This is my schedule." "Insufficient," Agnes said with a sharp shake of her head. "We need dedicated periods for hoard inventory, lair maintenance, and proper meal times. And frankly, your napping habits are erratic. It affects productivity." She produced a small, leather-bound notebook and a quill, which she had somehow salvaged from the library's wreckage. Now, regarding the hoard, we'll need to sort it by category. Jewels go here, she pointed to a cavern wall. Coins there. Weapons, scrolls, artifacts, each in its own designated area. We can even assign subcategories. Gold coins by region and era, for example. Silver coins can be a separate section entirely. Smugustus let out a low growl that caused a cascade of lesser gems to trickle down a gold mountain. Are you mad, human? This is centuries of my accumulated might. It is not some dusty provincial library to be indexed. It is a dusty provincial library at the moment, Agnes retorted, and a rather poorly maintained one at that. We'll start with the scrolls. I've noticed a distinct lack of archival practices. They're just piled up. Do you even know what half of these say? They are treasures, Smugustus boomed. Ancient treaties, forgotten spells, maps to lost kingdoms. Precisely, Agnes exclaimed. Which means they need proper preservation and cataloging. We'll need to construct some shelving for a start. Perhaps we can repurpose some of these less historically significant broadswords? And we'll need a proper labeling system. Alphabetical by subject? Chronological? We can discuss it during our daily planning meeting. Smugustus groaned, a sound usually reserved for when particularly tough knight armor got stuck in his teeth. A daily planning meeting. He closed his eyes, wishing for the simpler days when his biggest concern was avoiding overly ambitious heroes. This human was a new, terrifying kind of hero, one armed with organization and a complete lack of fear. Over the next few weeks, a peculiar routine took hold. Agnes, against all draconic expectation, began to make inroads into the hoard. She insisted on a specific section for sentient magical artifacts, handle with care, much to Smugustus's grumbling. She designated another area for lesser goblin trinkets, for eventual charitable donation or melting. She even dared to criticize his lair's cleanliness. Honestly, Smugustus, the sheer volume of dust bunnies is astounding. And this corner here, she pointed to a shadowy recess, appears to be home to several millennia of cobwebs. It's unhygienic. And frankly, it's clutter. Clutter is the enemy of efficiency. Smugustus found himself doing things he never thought possible. He used a carefully controlled puff of fire to clear cobwebs, after Agnes provided detailed instructions on optimal flame pressure. He grudgingly helped Agnes sort through piles of ancient armor, occasionally incinerating a particularly rusty helmet accidentally. He even found himself, to his immense mortification, listening to Agnes explain the Dewey Decimal System for scrolls. His posture, Agnes noted with a tiny, satisfied nod, was still terrible, but she was working on it. Shoulders back, head up, Smugustus. A dragon of your stature should exude confidence, not perpetual slouching. Smugustus would sigh, a cloud of smoke filling the cavern, but he would, almost imperceptibly, straighten his neck. He still bellowed, still complained, but a strange, grudging respect was beginning to form within his ancient heart. He had chosen her for her quiet strength. He was beginning to realize that quiet strength was a far more formidable weapon than any sword or spell. One particularly frustrating afternoon, Agnes was attempting to disentangle a pile of tangled magical amulets from a nest of forgotten goblin socks. "This is simply atrocious," she muttered, holding up a particularly noxious sock. "And frankly, Smugustus, your methods of acquisition are severely lacking in refinement." Smugustus, who was attempting to read an ancient scroll, Agnes had, to his horror, enforced a no-fire-breathing near-parchment rule, looked up, perturbed. "My methods of acquisition are legendary. I take what I want. That is the dragon way." "It's outdated," Agnes stated matter-of-factly. Bursting in, roaring, and incinerating a few villagers might have been effective in the Dark Ages, but in the modern era, it's simply inefficient. Think of the paperwork, the diplomatic repercussions, the inevitable hero quests you attract. Hero quests are excellent exercise, Smugustus retorted, a plume of smoke escaping his nostrils. And they provide fresh additions to the hoard. Only if you don't incinerate the heroes along with their loot, Agnes pointed out. A common error I've noticed. Furthermore, your kidnapping technique was, as I mentioned, terribly executed. No follow-up, no demands, simply, you are adequate. It lacks panache. Smugustus slammed the scroll down, narrowly missing a priceless elven tiara. "What do you suggest, human? That I send an engraved invitation? Greetings, most esteemed librarian Smugustus the Magnificent. Cordially invites you to his lair for a lifetime of companionship?" He scoffed. "Ridiculous. Not entirely, Agnes replied, surprisingly serious. A more nuanced approach. Perhaps a series of riddles leading the prospective mate to your lair? Or a well-placed advertisement in a reputable periodical. Ancient wealthy dragon seeks companion for long-term cohabitation, must appreciate fine gold and tolerate occasional volcanic eruptions. You could even list your hobbies. Enjoy long flights, napping on treasure, and critiquing the current state of draconic literature. Smugustus stared at her, utterly flabbergasted. You are suggesting I negotiate for a mate? It saves on property damage, Agnes said, shrugging. And frankly, the element of surprise is overrated when you're trying to establish a healthy, long-term relationship. Communication is key, Smugustus. And clear expectations. You never even told me why you needed a mate, beyond ancient tradition. It's hardly compelling. Smugustus slumped, feeling a strange mix of exasperation and something akin to vulnerability. He had never considered it from this perspective. He had simply followed the ancient texts, the ingrained draconic instincts. I am lonely, he rumbled, the admission escaping him before he could stop it. The vast cavern, filled with untold riches, suddenly felt incredibly empty. The hoard is magnificent, but it is cold. And the whispers of the wind grow tiresome. Agnes paused, the goblin sock forgotten. She looked at the immense ancient dragon slumped amongst his treasures, suddenly appearing far less terrifying and far more lost. A grudging softness entered her eyes. Well, that's a start, she said, her voice gentler. Honest communication. Good. Now, about these outdated kidnapping protocols. We could develop a best practices manual. It would be a fascinating research project. And it would definitely improve your long-term success rates. Smugustus, for the first time in centuries, felt a flicker of something other than pride or irritation. He looked at the small human, so utterly unimpressed by his power, yet so intensely focused on improving his life. Perhaps, he mused, a companion wasn't just about tradition or splendor. Perhaps it was about someone who saw past the scales in the fire and instead saw a lonely, magnificent, yet utterly disorganized dragon. He still didn't understand this human, not entirely, but he was beginning to think he might want to. The transformation of Smugustus's hoard from an inspiring mountain of chaos into an indexed, compartmentalized archive was the focus of the next few months, a process Agnes dubbed the Great Categorization. She moved with the unflappable certainty of a field marshal commanding troops, utilizing the dragon's raw power as a glorified lifting apparatus. Smugustus, for his part, tried to retain some dignity by maintaining a theatrical level of complaint. This is an insult to the accumulated majesty of centuries. I am not a common warehouse drone, human. My claws are made for crushing, not for sorting. Agnes, perched atop a scaffolding she had insisted Smugustus magically solidify from a pile of bronze shields, merely adjusted her spectacles. Claws are perfectly acceptable for sorting, provided you manage your grip strength. And you are not a drone, you are a co-curator. Now focus, Smugustus. This pile of jewelry, do we classify it under decorative items pre-Goblin War, or minor enchantments primarily defensive? The distinction is critical, the dragon grumbled, but he obediently nudged a selection of dusty necklaces into the designated decorative items chute, a repurposed, giant-sized hourglass. Agnes used to ensure the smaller coins weren't mixed with the larger gems. Agnes had developed a rudimentary but effective system based on the principles of the ancient draconic classification system, DCS, which she had painstakingly reconstructed from fragmented scrolls she had retrieved from the unsorted parchment mountain. The main categories were aurum, coins and precious metals, gemmi, jewels and raw gems, armamenta, weapons, armor, and shields, and the highly contentious arcana, magical artifacts, scrolls, and sentient items. Within the arcana section, she insisted on creating a separate, sealed enclosure for items that were actively dangerous or liable to complain loudly. Smugustus was surprisingly compliant with this, having grown tired of a certain talking mirror's incessant commentary on his eating habits. The physical labor was immense. Smugustus learned to use his tail to sweep fine dust into neat piles, and to use his fire breath not for incineration, but for carefully heating and polishing dull gold, a task he discovered provided an odd, primal satisfaction. He learned to distinguish between an elven war helm from the Third Age and a common human knight's pot helm, a nuance he previously would have dismissed as irrelevant. This leather strap is clearly inferior quality, he noted one day, inspecting a saddle. It would never withstand a sudden mid-flight maneuver. Agnes beamed, a rare, genuine smile that made the cavern feel suddenly less cold. Precisely, Smaugustus. Attention to detail. One day, while moving a heavy, locked chest, Smaugustus paused. Agnes, he rumbled, his voice low. Why does this chest contain only iron door hinges? They are neither beautiful nor valuable. Agnes descended the scaffolding. Ah, yes, the hinges. That is the miscellaneous but interesting metals section. I suspect they were a trade item or perhaps simply discarded construction material. Why did you hoard them? Smaugustus shifted his massive weight uncomfortably. It was a very small king, human. The day I stole his treasury, he had just installed those hinges. They were new. They smelled of fresh oil and success. They were a tally. They represented a triumph. Agnes looked at the pile of mundane iron with sudden understanding. To her, they were junk. To Smaugustus, they were a specific, tangible memory, a silent bookmark in the epic of his life. I see, she said quietly. Then we shall relabel this section. Triumphs, minor and metaphorical. But we still need to dust them. Smaugustus let out a soft rumble, a sound that was closer to contentment than complaint. Agnes's ability to understand the meaning behind his chaos rather than just the mess itself was slowly, imperceptibly, bridging the chasm between them. He realized he wasn't just working for her. He was working with her, building an ordered narrative of his own life. The sudden imposition of order on a legendary chaos was, inevitably, noticed. A hoard, when well organized, gleams brighter, reflects more light, and its sheer categorized magnitude projects a more formidable magical signature. Smaugustus's lair, once a hidden secret guarded by fear, was now a beacon of well-maintained wealth. The first sign of this unwelcome notice was a high-pitched, insistent rapping on the magically solidified obsidian of the lair's main door. Smaugustus bristled, smoke curling from his nostrils. A hero, finally! I shall incinerate him and claim his meager magical sword. That will certainly break up this tedious sorting session. Hold on, Agnes commanded, rushing to the door with a small brass hearing horn pressed to the stone. That is not the rhythmic, heavily armored sound of a hero. That is the officious, repetitive rap of an inspector. She pulled the heavy wooden bar she had insisted on installing across the entrance. Identify yourself, a small, nervous voice squeaked from the other side. I am Barnaby Flustercup from the Royal Exchequer, Bureau of Extranormal Wealth and Taxation. We've received an anomaly report. Your hoard's magical signature has suddenly stabilized and tripled in perceived value. I'm here to conduct a mandatory inventory and assessment for back taxes. Smaugustus roared, a sound that shook the mountain. Taxes! I am an ancient sovereign power. I have never paid taxes. He lunged for the door, fire gathering in his throat. Smaugustus, no! Agnes yelled, grabbing a spare chain she used for securing the most volatile artifacts. Thank you, overgrown reptile. Incinerating a tax official only invites a full-scale military audit. And trust me, those forms are worse than any hoard cleanup. We must deal with this diplomatically. Diplomatically? I will diplomatically turn him into ash. Smaugustus threatened. You will not, Agnes said, her eyes flashing with a sternness that often quelled his worst impulses. You will use your words. I will handle the inventory. She unlocked the door and pulled it open, just wide enough for a terrified, bespectacled gnome in a worn suit to squeeze through. Barnaby Flustercup staggered in, blinked once at the sheer, organized magnitude of the gold, then fainted dead away. Agnes sighed. Honestly, the lack of professional stamina. When Barnaby was revived with a glass of surprisingly good water, Agnes had also insisted on filtering the natural spring in the back of the cave. The real ordeal began. Smaugustus was forced to sit in the corner, sullenly watching as Agnes presented the hoard, not as a chaotic mess, but as a meticulously organized collection. As you can see, Mr. Flustercup, Agnes explained, pointing to a towering stack of categorized gold bars. Category ORMG, 14th century, pre-edict of the golden scale. Assessed market value is detailed in this ledger. She gestured to a large slate tablet where she had painstakingly recorded initial estimates. Barnaby's eyes glazed over. And here in the Arcana section, we have the lesser sentient magical items, mostly just talking cups, nothing of serious value. We've separated the historically significant scrolls. Those are under preservation, not for assessment. Smaugustus could only watch, utterly bewildered. This was far more devastating than any hero fight. Agnes wasn't just defying the gnome, she was confusing him with competence. Barnaby, overwhelmed by the sheer unexpected order, stammered, But the chaos reports. The magnitude. It's supposed to be impenetrable. It was, Agnes admitted, giving Smugustus a brief, pointed glare. But we decided a refined, accessible hoard better reflects the owner's status and efficiency. Look, if you need a specific artifact, I can retrieve it within minutes. Try that in the old arrangement. Barnaby, thoroughly defeated by the paperwork, signed off on a provisional tax assessment that only covered a fraction of the hoard's actual value, mostly because he couldn't face the paperwork required to audit the newly established arcana subcategories. As the gnome scurried away, shaking, Smugustus rumbled, a mixture of awe and bewilderment in his voice. Human, you saved me from paperwork. That was magnificent. More terrifying than any firestorm I have ever conjured. Agnes smiled triumphantly. Chaos is predictable, Smugustus. Bureaucracy is not. Now about that small cache of gems you forgot to declare. The unexpected visit from the taxman rattled Smugustus far more than he cared to admit. He was accustomed to external threats being tangible. Swords, spells, siege engines. Bureaucracy and forms were an invisible poison that felt impossible to incinerate. Agnes had protected him from it, and the gratitude, though unspoken, was immense. This made him, in turn, slightly more receptive to her ceaseless critiques. One evening, during their scheduled lair aesthetics and ergonomics discussion, Agnes returned to her favorite subject, the posture, Smugustus. I keep telling you, you are slouching. It's putting terrible strain on your 7th and 8th thoracic vertebrae. Smugustus was draped across a pile of freshly polished silver platters, his long neck curved low. It is a comfortable position, human. It allows me to survey my domain with relaxed authority. It communicates lethargy and poor bone density, Agnes countered, tapping his flank with a wooden pointer she used for inventory. Tell me honestly, why the slump? You are, by any measurable standard, the most magnificent creature in the known world. Why hide that? The cavern grew silent, save for the faint, resonant hum of the magically sealed arcana section. Smugustus raised his massive head, his molten eyes fixed on Agnes, no longer with irritation, but with a surprising depth of sadness. When I was young, he rumbled, his voice low and guttural, my scales were bright copper, not obsidian. I was magnificent, yes, but I was also weak. A larger, older dragon, a rival named Felnar, came to challenge me for my first meager hoard. I tried to stand tall, to display my dominance. He paused, a plume of smoke escaping his nostrils. Not of anger, but of old humiliation. Felnar laughed. He said I was too brightly colored, too straight-spined, too visible. He said I was a target. He defeated me easily, took my hoard. I had to flee and start anew. When I eventually returned and defeated Felnar, when I took his true treasure, I never forgot his words. I learned to draw my wings inward, to curve my neck low, to blend into the shadows of the cave. To be magnificent, yes, but also to be unobtrusive. To hide the soft, vital underside from the sun, the sky, and all who might strike. Agnes froze, the pointer dropping to the silver platters with a soft clatter. She looked at the ancient, powerful beast, and for the first time, she saw not the arrogant legend, but the deeply wounded creature. His chaos wasn't arrogance. It was camouflage. His terrible posture wasn't sloppiness. It was a deeply ingrained defense mechanism. His loneliness, the reason for the clumsy, outdated abduction, was rooted in a history of profound insecurity and fear of betrayal. He was afraid to truly be seen. She moved closer, ignoring the instinctual danger his immense size represented. She reached up a small human hand and gently placed it on a warm, smooth scale near his shoulder. Smugustus, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Felnar was wrong. Being straight-spined is not weakness. It is integrity, and hiding yourself in the shadows is no longer necessary. You are Smugustus. You own this mountain and everything within it. You are magnificent because you stand tall. The dragon remained utterly still. The warmth of her tiny hand on his cold scale felt foreign and startling. He felt the pure, non-judgmental empathy of her touch, the first true solace he had received in centuries. He could have easily incinerated her, but he felt a strange, terrifying fragility in her presence. It was the fragility of truth, of being vulnerable to someone who saw him as he truly was. Slowly, carefully, Smagustus lifted his head higher, his neck straightening, his wings beginning to unfurl slightly. He didn't achieve perfect posture, but the change was profound. He was allowing himself to be magnificent again, just for her. Agnes smiled, a genuine soft smile that reached her eyes. "Good," she murmured. "Now let's talk about the necessity of a dedicated ergonomic roost." The shared vulnerability of Chapter 7 solidified their peculiar cohabitation. Smagustus now understood that Agnes wasn't just organizing the Hoard. She was organizing his life, his emotions, and his sense of self-worth. Agnes, in turn, understood that Smagustus was not a monster. He was a magnificent ancient creature with severe anxiety and organizational deficits. Agnes, deciding that the sheer volume of gold was aesthetically overwhelming, insisted on establishing a dedicated companion quarters. This was not part of the Hoard. It was a home. She directed Smagustus to clear out a smaller secondary cavern near the spring and, using repurposed stone and wood salvaged from his less historically significant broadswords, they constructed a cozy, functional space. It had a proper stone floor, a working hearth, a small library niche, with shelves of course, and a surprisingly comfortable bed woven from salvaged silk banners. The construction phase was a masterclass in compromise. Smagustus wanted to decorate the hearth with the skull of a giant troll. Agnes countered with the necessity of a proper ventilation system and a sturdy mantle for books. The result was a compromise, a well-ventilated hearth with a stone mantle, upon which rested a small, polished troll skull, placed there, ironically, as a bookend. One evening, after a long day of arguing over the optimal temperature for cleaning priceless tapestries, Agnes sat by the hearth, reading an old, water-stained copy of Draconic Tax Law and Exemption Strategies, which Smagustus insisted was highly educational. Smagustus, for once, was not draped over gold, but lay curled around the entrance of the small cavern, his massive head resting near the threshold, watching her. He was silent, his breathing a slow, rhythmic rumble that acted as a soothing counterpoint to the crackle of the fire. Agnes looked up, not in response to a task, but simply to look at him. She saw the new straightness in his neck, the way his scales caught the firelight, and the quiet contentment in his golden eyes. She realized that the initial, terrifying fear she had felt was long gone, replaced by a deep, almost domestic familiarity. She knew the exact pattern of a chipped scale on his left wing, the subtle way his tail twitched when he was contemplating a fire breath, and the low, contented purr he made when she found a misplaced item he had forgotten he owned. "Smagustus," she said softly, marking her page. "Thank you. For the hearth. It's lovely." The dragon shifted slightly, his massive eye blinking slowly. "It is adequate, human. It is organized. And the lack of gold on the floor prevents unfortunate slips when moving quickly." "It's more than adequate," Agnes insisted. "It's peaceful." She patted the space beside her. "I made a small pot of herbal tea. It's not your preferred molten sulfur, but it's warming. Would you care to join me?" Smagustus considered the offer. Sharing a warm, non-incendiary beverage with a human in a non-Hoard space seemed absurdly domesticated. It was entirely undraconic. Yet the thought of returning to his silent, cold pile of treasure suddenly felt incredibly empty. He slowly, carefully extended his snout towards the hearth, his massive form seeming to shrink in the confines of the small home Agnes had made. He watched as Agnes poured a small cup of tea, a thimble-sized amount to him, and placed it gently on the stone. He lowered his head, his golden eye gazing at the delicate teacup, then back at Agnes. He took a long, slow breath, a deep draconic sigh that was now almost entirely free of smoke. Agnes took a sip of her own tea, and in the quiet of the small firelit cave, a moment of profound, shared tranquility settled between them. Smagustus realized, with a sudden, startling clarity, that he no longer needed the ancient draconic tradition to justify her presence. He needed her because she was the only one who could bring true warmth, order, and life to his magnificent, but utterly cold, Hoard. He was no longer just the owner of a treasure, but a resident in a home, and the thought of her leaving was now more terrifying than any army of heroes. The quiet domesticity that had settled over Ember Peak was shattered not by a roar or a blast of fire, but by the insistent clatter of a climbing party equipped with ropes and academic credentials. A group of official delegates from the Royal Society of Ancient Draconic Law and History arrived at the lair's entrance. their climb guided by the precise, stabilized magical signature of the Hoard. A signature that, ironically, Agnes's organization had inadvertently made traceable. Smagustus roared in irritation at the interruption, but Agnes, clutching a list of outstanding inventory tasks, immediately recognized the diplomatic gravity. These were not heroes seeking gold. They were scholars seeking answers, and more importantly, seeking her. The lead delegate, a stout gnome named Professor Eldred, addressed Smagustus with nervous deference. "Magnificent Smagustus, forgive the intrusion. We are here concerning the human Agnes Nettle. She was, reported missing from the Ethelgard Grand Library, and as the original abduction was, shall we say, non-consensual." Agnes cut him off with a firm cough. "It was extremely inefficient and entirely non-consensual, Professor. Do use the correct terminology." She then turned to Smagustus, who was observing the scene with a coiled, protective stillness she hadn't seen in months. "Smagustus, this is a formal diplomatic inquiry. They have come to ensure I am being held according to reasonable draconic tradition, and more critically, they are offering me transport home." The cavern grew silent. Smagustus's magnificent obsidian head lowered, his golden eyes fixed on Agnes with an intensity that made her heart skip. He didn't roar, he didn't threaten, but a deep, sorrowful tremor ran through his scales. You may leave, human," he rumbled, the words forced out, brittle with pride and pain. "I am Smagustus. I do not detain those who wish to depart. The ancient tradition mandates that the mate must be suitable and willing. If the classification is now unwilling, then the acquisition is nullified." He turned away, his massive form slumping slightly despite Agnes's best efforts to improve his posture. The sight of his vulnerability twisted a knot in Agnes's stomach. Professor Eldred, seeing his opening, rushed forward. "Agnes, you are free. We have supplies, a safe path. You can return to your life, your books, your colleagues." He gestured toward the chaotic, unsorted world outside the orderly haven she had built. Agnes looked at the gnome, then at the soaring, organized beauty of the Hoard, categorized by era and metallurgy. She looked at the small, cozy companion quarters with its ergonomic stone mantel, and she looked at the immense, lonely dragon who had just, with heartbreaking dignity, offered her freedom. "Professor Eldred," Agnes said, drawing herself up to her full, modest height. "While I appreciate the effort, there seems to be a slight misunderstanding. I was abducted, yes, but the terms of my captivity have changed. We are currently in the middle of the Arcana subcategorization project, which is highly complex due to the varying degrees of sentience and preservation requirements of the scrolls. Furthermore," she continued, her voice gaining the steely tone she reserved for unruly library patrons, "Smagustus's thoracic vertebrae are only just beginning to show signs of improvement. Leaving now would constitute professional negligence on my part, and frankly, organizational betrayal." Professor Eldred stared, bewildered. "But your life? The city? The sunshine?" "The integrity of a Hoard is paramount," Agnes declared. "And the Hoard's owner is currently facing a crisis of self-worth and a mountain of inventory backlogs. I cannot, in good conscience, abandon a project of this magnitude simply because of an archaic and poorly executed kidnapping." She then turned to Smagustus, whose head was lifting slowly, hope flickering in his golden eyes. "However, Smagustus, this does change the nature of our arrangement. From this point forward, I am not your suitable mate acquired through ancient tradition. I am your co-curator, collaborator, and chief organizational consultant. My presence is conditional on a formal partnership agreement, including proper compensation, mostly in new shelving materials." Smagustus let out a rumble that sounded suspiciously like a relieved laugh. The gnome fainted again, defeated by paperwork one last time. The formalization of their partnership brought a new sense of purpose to the lair. Agnes and Smagustus were a team, one fighting chaos with classification, the other fighting it with claws. Yet the newly stabilized magical signature of the highly organized Hoard, which Agnes affectionately referred to as a beacon of administrative excellence, had not only attracted tax officials, but a far greater, more ancient peril. Felnar, the larger, older dragon who had wounded Smagustus's pride centuries ago, had been alerted to the massive, contained power now emanating from Ember Peak. Felnar was drawn by the scent of perfection, viewing the organized Hoard as a trophy ripe for the taking. The attack came without warning. It was not a grand siege, but a silent, malevolent intrusion. Smaugustus, enjoying a rare moment of relaxed, improved posture while reviewing Agnes's weekly inventory report, suddenly tensed. The air in the cavern, usually thick with the rich scent of gold and dust, shifted, smelling sharply of ozone and old malice. "Felnar!" Smaugustus hissed, the name a stone in his throat. He seeks to take the Hoard. He senses the strength, but he does not understand its source. Felnar burst through the secondary mountain entrance with a shattering roar. A dragon twice Smaugustus's size, his scales the color of burnt umber and his eyes radiating contempt. His voice, heavy with disdain, echoed through the cavern. "Smaugustus, still hoarding trinkets like a common serpent. I smell order in here, disgusting, and a human female. Have you truly sunk to keeping a pet?" The shame is immense. Felnar's true target was immediately clear. He didn't dive for the gold. He targeted the organized sectors. With a massive swipe of his tail, he annihilated the neatly labeled shelf dedicated to minor enchantments, primarily defensive, sending ancient amulets and newly acquired categorization cards scattering. He then turned his fiery breath toward Agnes's beloved library niche. "I will teach you the true meaning of chaos, little worm." Smaugustus roared in pure protective fury, a sound that shook the very foundations of the mountain. Felnar's attack on the Order was an attack on Smaugustus's heart, a direct assault on the fragile new self-worth Agnes had helped him build. He moved with a speed and clarity he hadn't possessed in centuries. Gone was the clumsy, hunched posture. He was straight-spined, focused, and terrifyingly efficient. "You will not touch her shelves," he bellowed, intercepting Felnar's fire with a shield of pure draconic force. The ensuing battle was a maelstrom of fire, scale, and ancient fury. Felnar fought with brute strength and contempt, aiming to scatter the Hoard and break Smaugustus's spirit. But Smaugustus fought with a focused precision Felnar couldn't match. He had the home field advantage, and more importantly, he had a librarian. While the two colossal dragons clashed, sending shockwaves of heat and debris across the cavern, Agnes was not cowering. She was in her element. Chaos had arrived, and she was the only one capable of managing it. Her glasses were firmly in place, her face set in a grim expression of determination. "Smaugustus," she shouted over the cacophony, ducking behind a newly constructed barricade of bronze shields. "Felnar is using low-grade earth-shaking roars. They're destabilizing the armamenta. Get him away from the central foundation." Smaugustus heard her, his immense brain processing the tactical information instantly. He knew the precise location of the Horde's weak points thanks to Agnes's meticulous structural assessment reports. Using his superior knowledge of the lair's integrity, he lured Felnar toward the section designated Lesser Goblin Trinkets, an area Agnes had filled with unstable, fragile, and entirely disposable items. Felnar, blind to the true layout, followed, believing Smaugustus was fleeing to protect his most precious gold. As Felnar launched a devastating, fiery attack, Smaugustus executed a swift, calculated movement, redirecting the flames toward the ground, just as Agnes had instructed him in their emergency lair defense drill meetings. The concentrated heat blast detonated the pile of unstable goblin trinkets, creating a massive, noisy, and temporarily blinding explosion of worthless rubble and foul-smelling smoke right in Felnar's face. "Now, Smaugustus! The Arcana!" Agnes yelled, running toward the securely sealed enclosure she had created for dangerous magical artifacts. Smaugustus, coughing from the smoke, understood. He needed a weapon, and thanks to Agnes, he knew exactly where to find the perfect one. While Felnar was momentarily stunned, Smaugustus darted toward the classified Arcana section. Agnes, using a specific series of lever pulls she had catalogued, released the magical seal, opening the door just enough for the dragon to reach in. Section A14, Subcategory M. "The Orb of Muting Sound," Agnes commanded, her voice ringing with the authority of a world-class archivist. Smaugustus's eyes locked onto the perfectly labeled and shelf-stable orb. He snatched it, the clarity of the search process taking mere seconds, a feat that would have been impossible in the old chaotic Hoard. He spun around, the orb glowing faintly in his claw, and hurled it with devastating force at the charging Felnar. The Orb of Muting Sound did not harm Felnar physically, but when it struck his massive snout, it completely neutralized his ability to roar or breathe fire for one agonizing minute. Felnar was reduced to a sputtering dragon, unable to unleash his signature weapon. "Now, Smaugustus!" "Posture," Agnes yelled. Smaugustus didn't hesitate. He stood to his full magnificent height, a terrifying column of obsidian scale and refined, straight-spined pride. He lunged, driving Felnar backward, not with wild abandon, but with the focused, efficient fury of a creature defending his home, his hoard, and his co-curator. The lack of chaos in Smugustus's defense utterly demoralized Felnar. He had come expecting a brute. He found a strategist. Felnar, defeated not by raw power but by efficiency and organization, retreated in a humiliating scramble, leaving behind only the rubble of the goblin trinkets and a very large, angry scorch mark near the ventilation shaft. Smugustus watched him go, then let out a colossal, triumphant roar, a roar that was deep, powerful, and utterly steady, no longer tainted by anxiety or fear. He then turned to Agnes, his breathing heavy, his scales scored, but his golden eyes shining with a pride she had never seen before. Agnes, though covered head to toe in soot and dust, was already assessing the damage. The orb of muting sound has been deployed. Retrieval and resealing are now priority 1. The goblin section is a total loss, obviously, but we can reuse the rockfall to reinforce the secondary entrance. And Smugustus, she added, her voice softening, your posture was flawless. Truly majestic. Smugustus lowered his head, not in a slump, but in a bow of profound respect. Agnes, he rumbled, the sheer volume of the cavern suddenly feeling intimate. You did not leave when you had the chance. You stayed to save my shelves, my home, and my self-respect. He hesitated, gathering the immense courage required to speak the final truth. The ancient tradition, it speaks of a mate to guard the hoard. But I now know the truth. I do not need a mate to guard the gold. I need a partner to guard me. I need you, Agnes, for your heart, your mind, and your unrelenting belief in organization. Agnes walked through the debris, her sensible shoes crunching over gold dust, until she stood directly beneath his massive snout. She reached up and, despite the lingering heat, gently touched a rough scale near his nose. I know, Smugustus, she whispered, and I have, rather grudgingly, come to realize that I need you too. Someone to appreciate my meticulous cataloging, and someone to provide the necessary scale and firepower when the need arises. She looked him straight in the eye. And frankly, I couldn't bear the thought of Felnar messing up my classification system. That would be a tragedy. Smugustus chuckled, a low rumble of pure contentment that shook the remaining dust from the ceiling. He had his answer. He lowered his snout, allowing his new partner a moment of peaceful connection. The ancient draconic tradition was dead, replaced by a new, far more enduring one, the bond between a grumpy, magnificent lizard and his feisty, organized human. Together, they set about rebuilding. Agnes created the final, most crucial document, the Nettle-Smugustus Partnership Charter, detailing mutual responsibilities, inventory protocols, and a clause mandating a strict 20 minutes of ergonomic stretching daily for the dragon. Smugustus officially began his new project, dictated by Agnes, titled A Comprehensive Indexed, An Annotated History of Draconic Abduction Failures, a Cautionary Tale for Future Generations. The Hoard, once cold and chaotic, was now a vibrant, ordered, and very warm home, and the dragon, Smugustus, finally learned that the true treasure was not the gold he amassed, but the heart he had unintentionally acquired.